as literally was the case in my previous book about the iPod, where I wrote it like a shuffle, where each chapter can be separate. And literally we did the order, and there were several different versions of the book, by having my son and my niece pick out ping pong balls and reorder the chapters there. Back to the other one about where I first met it. Now, working for Newsweek, I would try to keep track of new things. And this is in 1999. I think, actually it was late 1998, I learned about the Google search engine. I wrote about it just a little in February of that year, but I determined I really want to go and visit these people because it seemed really an important startup and something that could grow into something else. So the person who was in charge of public relations then, Sydney McCaffrey, I'd known from her work at Apple. I called her up and said, Cindy, I've got to meet these guys. She said, you know, you're going to love them. Come on over. They had just moved into the place on Bayshore, and it was October in 1999, which I remember very easily because everyone was decked out for Halloween. And Larry was dressed like a Viking. He had a big furry vest, big horns coming out of his head, and his hat.
That's not his day-to-day costume? I mean,
yeah, well, it could have been. And Sergey was dressed like a cow. He had these disgusting big udders, these plastic udders out of his chest. So I went out there, you know, with all the medicine balls and segways and things like that, and the Viking and the cow took me into a room and explained PageRank to me.
It's like the best quote I've ever heard. The Viking and the cow explained PageRank to me. You've seen the inner workings of a lot of tech companies over the years, and now you've spent all this time with Google. How do you find them different, or perhaps even the same, you know, to the other companies you've observed?
Google was different, and the organizing principle of the book came from my realization of how different Google was. As you know, a lot of you know, there's been some previous books on Google, and I've always been fascinated by Google, but was involved in something else when the first wave of books came out around the IPO, and thought, well, I wanted to do something different, but couldn't figure out what. Then in the summer of 2007, I got invited to go along on a trip. Google has this program called Associate Product Managers. Early in their history, they decided that the product managers they were getting from places like Microsoft and other tech companies just didn't do it for them. They didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand that in Google, for instance, the engineers are going to call all the shots. A product manager is never going to tell an engineer what to do. Whether in design or an approach to something, you have to use data and convince the engineers how to do these things. And so they decided that they would get their product managers straight out of school before they're corrupted by these outside forces that did things differently. So they have this product, and actually a program, Marissa Mayer had the idea, and she went to her boss, Jonathan Rosenberg, and made a bet that she would be successful by getting these young people, just throw them in deep water. The very first APM was told, here's this project that we're doing with web-based mail called Gmail. You're the product manager. Go deal with these engineers. Tell Paul Buckheit what to do. And so this project has a program where it takes place over 2 years, where these associate product managers earn their stripes. And they do one thing for 1 year and a second thing for the second year. And in the middle, they go on an international trip. Marissa's kind of a den mother. She takes these young people to international offices, usually 4 of them or something like that. And in 2007, they invited me to come along. It was 2 weeks. We went to Tokyo, Beijing, Bangalore, and Tel Aviv, literally around the world. And I spent 16 days 24/7 with these people in Google. And it was like I was a Googler. I was immersed in this culture. And that's how I realized how different it was. That they operate like, try very, very hard to be like a startup in many, many ways. And I learned how important speed and scale was. It just came out in every single way. Like waiting, we stopped off in Bangkok, just for a few hours there. And they went insane because of the inefficiency of the passport process there, and they were figuring out metrics, how you could switch it differently, and they kind of planned out the different lines. They did sort of an A/B test to figure out which line was the quickest, and so I got a real sense of the Google culture there, and thought, wouldn't it be great to do a whole book like that, where I'm immersed like that. And that's when I asked for permission and started negotiating the terms by which I would do this book.
It's interesting, you talk about their culture. Historically, they're known for doing projects in relatively small teams and relatively unhindered or unfettered by management. We've seen a change at the top now, with Larry Page coming back as CEO of the company. And obviously Google has grown into this very, very large company. Do you see how they approach product development changing because of these changes? And how is that going to impact them now that they have grown up?
Well, throughout Google's history, there's been panic that, my God, we're becoming a big company. We have to roll things back. As early as 2001, Larry and Sergey had this huge panic that we've got too many middle managers here. Let's get rid of all the managers. Literally, they want to get rid of every single manager and have every engineer report to Wayne Rosing, who was the director of engineering at the time. And the people at HR went crazy. They said, well, you can't do that. This thing's going to be utter chaos. Yet they went ahead with it, and it proved out to be so unsuccessful because people actually wanted to be managed. And at one point, Bill Campbell, who was an advisor to the company, was trying to talk Larry out of it. And Larry was insisting that it would work, and he brought in managers. It was 8 o'clock at night one night, whoever they could find, they brought in there, and they asked them, do you want to be managed? And people said yes, but Larry said, no, they'll like it better the other way. Well, it didn't work, and they rolled it back. But their point was made. They wanted to do things differently. So throughout history, Google's history, they've been saying, this is getting out of hand, we have to roll it back. And this thing is maybe the most recent, I wouldn't call it panic, but attempt to address this, sclerosis, I don't know what you would call it, that maybe Google has to reclaim its moment there. And, I think things are different. I think Larry, since, even though he's not technically the CEO at this point, has become super energized from what I hear. And people are going to midnight meetings, weekend meetings, and lots more reviews, and getting these very detailed notes from Larry.
You talked about how Google is such a data-driven company, and if we're going to do anything, we're going to see what the data says, see what the users are doing, and going with it. And you've also covered and spent time with Apple, which seems sort of the opposite. We don't really care what the data is. We will tell you what it's going to be, and then you will come and do whatever we do. And is that a fair characterization? Are these kind of diametrically opposed companies that are still successful in both ways that they go about it?
Well, I think it's a fair characterization of the companies, but it sort of makes sense when you figure Apple makes consumer electronics, and Google is an internet-based company where its whole goal is to make information available to people, and that goes most of all internally. Those are the rules by which it takes to the infinite degree within the company. So all the metrics that you see them introducing to the outside, there's even more inside. Everything's measured. I mean, even everyone knows about the Google ad auctions, but they actually auction off server access in their data centers from different groups there. They actually have an auction process by which people sort of bid people against and time against data centers. When they open up a new data center and they want people to take the sometimes awkward step of moving from some of their servers from this data center to the other data centers, they get other carrots in return. There's sort of an auction that goes by the way. So it sort of makes sense that Google would be so much more data-driven than Apple there. But of course, in terms of philosophy, Google's much more design-driven too. The design people at Apple report directly to Steve. At Google, the design people are kind of frustrated. Larry is sort of has a very limited view of design. His idea is if there's too much animations or switchiness in the interface, that's just going to introduce latency. And he, above all, is a speed freak. Things have to run very, very fast. At Google, speed is motherhood and scale is apple pie. And those things are just built into everything that they do and the way they operate. And it's appropriate for that kind of company.
Google is coming against excuse me, a lot of external pressure. We're hearing a lot of demands for so-called transparency of their algorithms, which I think most of us in this room know is kind of ridiculous. I mean, they are, you know, open to a degree, but if they open up, you know, any more, they're vulnerable to spammers and so on. How do you think they should respond to this? And do you see any potential regulatory, you know, interference or issues that they're going to have to deal with?
Well, I find it fascinating to see this whole search neutrality meme being introduced. There's, you know, and I guess that's the term for saying that Google should open up their processes, and you know, and if people, you know, like in the recent update, find themselves lower in the rankings, they should have the explanation why. And some people say there should be oversight. You know, there was, you know, Danny, you know, wrote quite well about the New York Times weighing in on that. And I was pretty surprised to see the New York Times in there. And I think Google has a pretty good argument, as you know, I'm sure they've made here numerous times, that this is our opinion. Actually, a judge once ruled, and I think that's the reigning precedent, the search results are an opinion protected by the Constitution. It's free speech. So legally, they can, according to this, do what they want. But more than that, they say that philosophically and morally, they're out to serve their users by this. And if, you know, if the people who are ranked happen to fall or rise, that's just something that comes as a consequence of their judging is what's best for their users in the search results. And I think that's a pretty good argument, but of course it gets complicated by the fact that Google is so powerful. And I think Google has always had difficulty coming to grips with its power. They think of themselves as you know, startup people. It's a startup culture that they try to make it that way as much as they can. And it's sort of ironic that these people, who are some of the smartest people you could find anywhere, spend a lot of their time denying gravity, that they are so big. And so that's where the complications come in. I think, on the other hand, Microsoft and you know, AT&T, the Google competitors, have done a pretty good job of spreading that meme, you know, getting you know, European you know, regulatory interest up, you know, for their own competitive reasons. I find it wildly ironic that Microsoft, that during the 1990s, came under all this pressure for antitrust. And you know, for Bill Gates, you would think it was something he wouldn't wish on his worst enemy, but it turned out to be exactly what he was wished on his worst enemy. You know, and that's what he's doing with Microsoft is doing with Google.
Interesting.
It's interesting. On the one hand, you have some proponents of search neutrality, and Google shouldn't be touching the results, everything going on. And at the same time, you've had this big cry, especially over the past 2 months, of content farms are ruining the web, scrapers are ruining the web, you've got to get rid of all this junk. And so, of course, they rolled out the Farmer Panda update, I think 2 weeks ago now, which is them ultimately expressing an opinion and saying, okay, well, we're going to get rid of this stuff because we don't think it's serving our users. But you know, you've talked with them a bit and you've seen some of the reactions. How's your take on that? Do you feel like it seemed to have been working, and was it fair? And you think it's going to hold up in the face of all this new content coming in?
Well, I mean, you could look at the search results as a user and see that there's a difference there. One thing I always felt that Google did not a great job at was when you do a search for hotels. And you know, the people, I guess, who are in your audience here have done a good job of making it less useful than it should be. You know, because when I would, you know, put in the name of a hotel I wanted to stay at just to get a phone number, it would be, you know, all these places to help me book a hotel that weren't that particular hotel. And last week I went to TED. I stayed at the Westin Long Beach, and I typed it in. And PAL, Westin Long Beach, #1, and you know, Westin Long Beach related stuff came up, you know, dominated, you know, those first 10 links, which was what I wanted. And when I mentioned that to the Google search quality engineers, Matt Cutts and Amit Singhal, who I talked with about the update there, they weren't sure whether it was exactly that update which led to it, but it probably did have something to do with it. So something like that, it was incredibly useful. If you're looking for information on something, philosophically, it sort of makes sense that a site like the New York Times or Britannica.com or Wikipedia would come up higher than some place that found some random writer, writing for $20 to come up with a view on the subject I was looking for to come up high. And indeed, generally, those are the kinds of results they have. Now, where it gets sticky is where content, which is pretty good, gets knocked down for some of the algorithms they use. And they admit they're not there where they want to be to actually evaluate the value of the content. I always felt that ideally, Google should operate in a way that it couldn't be gamed. I used to work for a magazine in New Jersey before I wrote about technology, and I did a really big story about the educational testing service. And for many, many years, and this is before the time of most of you out there, they would say that, our SATs cannot be gamed. You could go and try to get coaching, but it would be a waste of your money because we measure people so well that coaching won't help there. And I did a story where I discovered that some of their social scientists working there actually done studies that found that coaching worked. And they suppressed those studies because they felt, gee, if people found that coaching was effective, then the whole game falls apart. It's not fair because we don't know who's coached and who's not coached. Well, actually what happened was ultimately they admitted that coaching worked and people still use the thing anyway. And now, there is this, taint on it, but everyone uses the metric anyway. I always felt that search results should be like that. That ideally, and can philosophically agree with it, Google should be good enough to be able to determine what is best for the user without having to, in a way where no one could game the thing, or it would even overwhelm a poorly designed website if the content was good enough. Now that's maybe an ideal, but when Google talks to you folks out there, it reminds me a lot of what the ETS says now. They say, well, now it really isn't coaching, you're actually learning. So when you take these courses, you're not learning how to game our system, you're just learning how to expand your vocabulary or do math better. So it's really education. And I think what happens now is people say, well, you're just making your websites better. And in a sense, of course that's true, because a website that's clearer to people, where the subject matter of the website is up top and very clear, makes for a better website. So to a certain degree that's clear. But I just think in an ideal world, it would just work.
Now, you were talking about Google's culture internally and how engineers are really, they're the guys or the women that are really, influential. But obviously, Google, being a big company, they've got, finance people, they've got the HR people you mentioned, they've got PR people. Mm-hmm. How is the interaction? You probably got to see, the interaction and how they work together. Right. Is it cordial? Is it combative? Talk about that aspect of their culture.
I think it's very cordial. When they hire people, they refer to the people who are non-technical, non-engineers as athletes, mental athletes that they could do these feats. But they're apart from the engineers. And if you work at Google, and people have said this to me quite explicitly, you have to come to grips with the fact that the engineers rule, and you learn to be happy with that. You know your place, because that's just the way Google is. It is a kingdom of the engineers there. And the people who aren't engineers understand that, and they're happy with it. They're respected. But they never have the status of engineers there. One of the early guys in advertising was talking to me and telling me about an early meeting they had. It was in one of the hotels near Google, and Sergey came, and he just wasn't even listening. He spent most of his time in the back of the room, examining the electronics in the AV box there. And the guy said, that's when I realized that basically what we do, they don't give a damn about. Actually, damn wasn't the word he used. And, but that's just Google.
You talked about how they want to and still believe that they're this startup company and are trying to keep all that going, but how can they do that? I mean, they are this sort of big bureaucratic company. Yeah. I talked to somebody yesterday, I won't name him, but it was interesting. He's going through the process of wanting to get hired. They want to hire him, and he says it's taken 5 months. And that's somebody that they want. Well,
it's interesting because Google will say now that their hiring process is not as convoluted as it used to be. It used to be, I've talked to many, many people who said, it took 10, 20 interviews. It takes like a long, torturous process. I actually got quite deeply into the hiring process there. And they even realized that it was just getting way out of hand. And then, of course, there's their insistence on getting everyone's SAT scores and GPAs, even if they're, people have been out in the workforce for 20 years. I remember this one fellow who was working in Marissa Mayer's group. He was 39 years old. He'd done a really successful startup, and he said, they asked me for my GPAs. I couldn't even find them. And they said, and it's interesting because here's one part, and I think this really comes from the bias of the founders, that they've done their own metrics and found there's limited value to that in what they do, yet they grasp them, just like colleges grasp on it. And it's very much like elite colleges choose their students there. They want to make sure that they're up to their standards. It's a metric. People rely on metrics. And Google people are suckers for metrics. I remember in one case where someone was arguing something to the board, or one of the Google's executive council, and they said, well, how certain are we this is going to work? He said, 87%. And they said, okay, and they went ahead with it. And I asked them, how did you know 87%? He said, I just picked that number, that made it look like specific, and it worked there. And but at a certain point, they said that this is getting out of hand, and they actually now, in order to do more than 8 interviews for a hire, you need permission. You have to go and get specific permission from HO to go beyond 8 interviews, because they have pretty firm metrics that after that, it really doesn't matter much. But that's still, they still have their biases in practice. And to this day, or at least as a few months ago when I last checked, every single hire at Google goes through Larry Page. Every single one. That's been over 30,000 people they've hired there. Every week or so, he gets this packet. And they develop this huge packet from the hiring council with all sorts of metrics and recommendations and other kinds of things. One thing that really helps you, actually, if your GPA isn't quite up there, is that if you've done something really special. Though I remember there's a story.
Extracurricular activities.
What?
Your extracurricular activities.
Yes, exactly. Just like if you want to go to Harvard and your GPA isn't quite where it should be, but you've won an Oscar, right? You're an actor. Harvard's going to take you. But with this particular person, it wasn't an engineer, but things weren't up there. But it turned out he was the Italian foosball champion, and Sergey really liked that. So he got the job,
That reminds me of David Crane, who was one of the higher level communications people. He and Larry apparently attended saxophone camp together.
Right.
So,
yes.
I mean, obviously something. Now, you were talking too about your trip with the Googlers to the international offices. How are things in those offices compared to the mothership? Are they the same kind of practices? Do they have relative autonomy? How does that work?
So they want those offices to be googly, right? And actually, I spent a lot of time with the people who set up the offices, and they have an amazing guy who's in charge of the facilities at Google, who came very, very early, George Sala, and he shared with me their design principles, which I talk about in there. But they also understand that that these things are embedded in a certain culture, so they try to accommodate that. They try to do 2 things at once. I don't think it's unusual that at Google there are some tensions between those engineering centers and Mountain View. It's the same as any company that has a headquarters and operations overseas. But they try to minimize those tensions by, and I'm talking about the engineering centers here, not the sales centers, by having a mix of local products and having some of the engineering teams contribute to the global products. Now, the one place where I focused most on is a unique center, which is China. And I really felt that the China story was really central to understanding Google in the way that it tries to hold to this higher moral principle. We've gone this far without mentioning don't be evil, but that is actually a big part of Google. It's not just a throwaway line, and it is a company which from the very start was founded in an attempt to set a higher moral standard, and they tried to get that across very explicitly in their IPO process, which was a little bumpy. And it still matters at Google, even though people don't say it so much. They, to this day, don't shrink away from using that or standing up to that. And at China is where it was really put to the test. And it was an amazing experience to document that, because they had very special tensions between Mountain View and Beijing, not just the usual tensions that they were away and away from the action, but because there were increasingly a number of people who were more and more unhappy with the compromise Google made to censor the search engine, and the people in China felt that they were there was a form of almost civil disobedience. A couple of people used that term to me from Mountain View to give China people the tools of what they needed to do their job effectively there. So, and that was an undertone. If you really look at the whole arc of what happened in China when they were attacked, which was the triggering mechanism by which they pulled the search engines, and effectively by stopping the censoring. But it was just the last step. It wasn't oh my God, things are going okay now. We have to stop because of this attack. Everyone said the term the straw that broke the camel's back kind of thing. But in my feeling, though some people at Google don't agree with me, it was headed that way anyway. And there actually was a group of very powerful Google executives who had concluded that we have to stop this before that attack.
They, and kind of related to this in the censorship, I mean, with China, that was probably the biggest cave that they had ever done. And then, of course, they eventually did come out of it. But, do you think that they should take a stronger stance in some of the government actions that come against them? There are other places where they'll do censorship. There's censorship here in the U.S. where there are things that they'll pull out of the search results, and they don't necessarily go through and say, we don't agree with this, we don't agree with this law, and we're going to go through and fight it. They pretty much say if there's a legal reason, we go with it.
Well, they're in a tough situation, and this is one thing because of Google's power that they're in a pretty tough situation, is that in a sense they have to step up and take responsibility for the whole web itself. So this came up early in the Jew Watch, controversy, let's say, where if you type the word Jew, J-E-W, into Google, one of the top results was this anti-Semitic site, Holocaust denying thing called Jew Watch. And for Sergey in particular, who left Russia because of anti-Semitism, this was very painful. Yet they did not remove that site from the search results, but solved it by their standards by taking out an ad themselves that would rest above the search results and explain why you saw this objectionable site in the results. I think that just came up again recently for I forget what it was, but some other horrible site. I thought that awful picture of Michelle Obama in image search. They did something very, very similar there. But I think just in general, in terms of privacy and other things, Google winds up not really effectively being able to brush off the way it operates by saying, that's not us, it's the web. Because Google is so much an instrument by which people, most of us, access the web, they, I think, have a responsibility to make things easier for people to deal with the web, right? And this comes up, a lot in the privacy issues there. I think one of the earliest and most important, issues of privacy is, not something like where Google mistakenly trolled the Wi-Fi streams of people, but just the fact that if you did something 10 years ago that's high in the search results, that comes up. Your top 10 results are your resume. And I think maybe, we'll see, maybe by their social, efforts that they're supposedly working on, maybe that'll be a way to address some of that. We've seen they have new profiles, and Google wants to know who you are now. And maybe that's a way to finally address that problem that we all have, really, in terms of the web's power in digging out things about us, which really may not be relevant to who we are, but turns out to have a large and sometimes negative impact on our perception.
It's interesting. We've been talking about Google, the search company, but Google is also now an enterprise software product company. They're developing self-driving automobiles.
Right.
They're getting into alternative energy. Do you see a risk of their losing their very early on slogan, having a, quote, laser-like focus on search with all these new initiatives that they're taking on?
Well, it's interesting. You look, and Google gets this rap as a one-trick pony. But two of their most prominent acquisitions were Android and YouTube. And if you look at them, I think anyone would have to agree that they were both successful acquisitions there, which is sort of amazing because it's very difficult to have an acquisition, to buy a company like that and successfully integrate it. There's so many failed acquisitions, and Google has had a share of them too. They spent $900 million for this radio, advertising company, which was a total disaster. They wrote off. But I think now, they've got very prominent, presence in the phone world. My own suspicion, Google won't say this, is that the next time a Spectrum auction comes around, I personally sense that Google won't be in it just to draw someone else in, but will be in it really bidding. And in the TV world, and we're going to see more of that. I think some things seem just kind of wacky, but the auto thing, not so much. I don't think that is at odds with what we know of as Google, because it's not just a search company. It really is an artificial intelligence company, a machine learning company. That's the way that the search engine works. That's the way the ad system works. So and their whole geo operation, works like that. So if you look at the autonomous cars as part of their geo operation, it's very tied in with the way search view works. Those cars get around as well as they do because they know what's around the corner. And if you think of it as a two-way thing, eventually, where cars are giving information to Google as well as getting information from Google, it's an AI system that's handling data about the world that just doesn't happen to be on the web. So I actually think that that's of a piece of what Google does.
You spent so much time with Google, and we've spent a lot of time there as well, and it can be difficult because you get to be friends with the people that are there, you are friends with people there, or whatever, and you have to pull
you put
back.
on weight at the cafes.
But then you have to pull back and you have to write things and that they may not like. So how do you avoid sort of Stockholm syndrome type of I don't want to make you mad, but I'm going to have to see you tomorrow or the next day after that type of thing, and still do the job that you have to do?
No. Well, I mean, ultimately that comes through. You just have to write what's important to your readers, and I'm not there to learn things for myself. I'm there to pass them on to the readers. So if I have to be critical, I have to be critical. Obviously, being exposed to the people there, and I have, I like a lot of them, and I've gotten friendly, with some of them. Sometimes, I've gone to dinner with some of them and not to talk about Google, but just to go out to dinner or things like that. But ultimately, that's what writers do, is they serve their readers there. So if, I guess because the people at Google have had such a good opportunity to present their case to me, I'm probably going to understand their side of the story more. Right. And really, the point of the book was not to, examine the arguments against Google from the points of view of the opponent, but to give people a sense of how people think inside Google. Right. And I am critical at points. There's one point we haven't mentioned where, after the DoubleClick purchase, where I, actually almost stop the narrative and just go into a little analysis of the DoubleClick cookie and how it's different from the AdSense cookie and the significance of that merger of, the DoubleClick, ad network and AdSense and what that meant in a way where I don't think it really was sufficiently explained at the time, and I went back and forth with Google on this, and so I know because of our discussions about this, I may have a different point of view than they have about that, but it was cordial, and they understand that I'm a reporter there.
Well, I'm personally really looking forward to your book. You've also done some other really interesting things in your life. In particular, you're known as the person who found Einstein's brain. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure. So this is way before my career as a technology writer. I think I mentioned that I worked at this magazine in New Jersey, and one day my editor said to me, "I want you to find Einstein's brain." I said, I didn't know it was missing. But it turned out that it was missing. It was taken, removed from Einstein's corpse, not his living head, in 1955 during his autopsy, ostensibly because, and it really isn't clear whether this is the case, he said he wanted it studied to see if we could learn anything from it. And this was well over 20 years later, and no one knew what happened to it. And indeed, there was no scientific study I could find or anything written about that. And I actually did manage to figure out the brain must be in the possession of this one guy who was the pathologist during the autopsy, but he had dropped out of sight. But then I did locate him in Wichita, Kansas, and before he could deny anything, arranged to go out and see him. And we were sitting in his office, and I was talking to him, and he was being evasive. And finally, after this long conversation, where he finally admitted he knew Einstein, he did the autopsy, he said, well, actually, it's here. And here in his office, and he walked behind me in this little office that we were sitting in the medical lab, and pulled out a cardboard box that said Costa Cider on the side. And there, in like 3 big jars, mason jars, giant like glass cookie jars almost, floating up and down was Einstein's brain. So I wrote a story about it, and it got picked up everywhere. Johnny Carson made a joke about it, and it was many people told me, "That's it. This is the highlight of your career. You might as well stop right now." But I guess I still had to write about Google.
Well, and among your career, you've done things like interviewed Bob Marley and Bruce Springsteen. What's the most fun story you think that you've ever done?
Well, the most fun stories are when you, like the Google trip, when you just go somewhere, and you're just like there in real time. I'm doing a story now. I don't want to say it is, but it is a lot of where the person who's in charge of the company that I'm watching says, "You are such a good fly on the wall," because and that's what I like. I really like to be involved and immersed inside something and see what's happening. Almost as if I'm a peer, at least temporarily, of the people who were there. And that was what was great about the Google thing. At a certain point, I was spending so much time on campus, and I remember I was talking about this to Eric Schmidt once. And he was asking me how things are going. And I said, it's like when you play guitar, you learn to play guitar, and for a certain point, you're just thinking where your fingers go, and you're looking at your fingers, and then you reach the point where they just move themselves there. And that's the way I got to feel at Google, that I really didn't have to have the hat on that I'm an outsider trying to ask them what's going on, which was pretty much the case as I was doing the stories for Newsweek. I did a lot of reporting on Google for Newsweek, which was great because I had all these interviews existing. I didn't have to ask Larry about how he did PageRank for the book, because I'd asked him all that stuff in 2002. And that's the way I felt. When I was in conversation with the people, I knew they have this weird jargon. There's all these terms and abbreviations there's GPSs and OKRs and, and these things. So I was, within a few minutes, I would talk to someone new, and they would feel at ease talking to me because I knew that jargon. And it was like they were talking to a fellow Googler. Right? So, and I was able to have a more productive conversation there. So, and that was great about it. I really love the idea that as a journalist, you could, be someone else and then come out of the experience, the deep sea submarine rises to the surface, and you could write what happened. I'll give the plug here.
Please do.
Simon & Schuster, the official publication date is April 12th, but by the beginning of April, you should find it. Or you could order it now from Amazon.com or your local bookstore.
Well, Stephen, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.